The working life of this watermill in the 19th century was as a most productive corn mill, with a huge amount of wheat and barley being ground to flour. There were 16 men employed in the mill to work it. It had its own 2 wagons with a stable of heavy horses for flour delivery. Today, the mill cart still survives. The lighter, 2-wheeled cart was used instead of the heavy 4-wheeled wagons for smaller loads, for it was easier to manhandle. The cart could be swung to bring its tailgate under the loading door, while the full-sized wagon could only be drawn up alongside.
Right. That's lovely. Yeah, put them down there. It's terrific.
The design of the mill enables you to get these wagons right up against underneath the door, and the miller would sit up there and he would be able to count out the sacks of flour into the wagon. And the great thing about these wagons was they enabled the whole of the milling enterprise here to operate right even through the last century into the beginning of this. Because sure, up until that time, the wagons could take the flour and distribute it to local towns. But once they were up against a lot of competition with milling from other parts of the world, what these carts enabled them to do was to not just take it to nearby towns, but to go up and down to the nearby railway station. And that shuttle service gave you a much wider distribution. So this was really one of the secret weapons of the miller. It enabled him to really be a commercial enterprise.
But the commercial distribution of the finished flour was only part of the story. It was just as important for grain to be not only brought to the mill, but taken easily right up to the top of the building for storage in the corn bins. For the mill works on gravity, depending on a flow of grain down through the system, to become flour by the time it reaches the bottom of the building. So the hoist chain, which is driven like everything else in the mill by the water, hauls the sacks of grain up into the lucum, which is the part of the mill that sticks out at the top as a permanently positioned crane and is a feature of virtually all watermills.
I'm right at the top of the mill, 5 stories up, and this is the oldest wooden piece of machinery in the mill. It's a large wheel which controls the hoist mechanism, both the internal hoist and the external hoist. Basically, it's a wheel that sits on an axle around which the chain winds, so you can control the chain height going up and going down. But how this is controlled itself is it sits on an axle. But this axle, despite its size, is able to be lifted up and down. Now, some floors down in the mill below here, there is a fixed axle. And what happens is by changing the position between the bottom axle and this one, by lifting this weight up and down, of course you slacken or increase the firmness of this belt. And that belt acts, in effect, as a clutch. There's a clutch mechanism, just like a clutch in a car, in wooden machinery.
When this drum is rotated, its spindle winds the leather belt, which lifts the beam, axle and wheel, and it's brought about by the miller just pulling on a cord. What seems impossible happens without a struggle, due to the counterbalance weight. So when the miller tugged the cord, the wheel began to turn, powered by the drive of the water floors below, and the hoist would bring up the corn through the mill. The trapdoors are made of 2-inch thick elm, which automatically close under their own weight, which stops the miller or the sack from falling through. Automation in wooden machinery. Once at the top of the mill, the grain on its arrival is very carefully weighed on large but accurate beam balances, so the miller knew exactly the amount entering the mill. When flour, it would be weighed again. Once on a level floor, the sack barrows cut down on carrying. The newly arrived grain was cleaned from bits by a winnowing machine before setting off on its journey down to the stones.
The stones here have really been left as when the miller stopped work. He just was told one day that the mill was no longer going to work, and so down towards, and everything was left as you now see it. And in effect, we can see exactly what the man was doing, because he'd opened up this pair of stones here, so one comes off and is here, and that is the bedstone, which doesn't move at all, and this is the runner that normally rotates on the top of that, and it sits on top of these gimbals here, and so the top one can turn round. And how they work is that the grain comes down to the centre and works its way out to the edge, but you've got on top of here a whole series of furrows, in effect, rather like a field that they've been cut in. So you've got high stone, low stone, high stone, low stone, and so on that one, and you've got a matching arrangement on this one. And so in effect what happens is one goes past the other and you get this cutting action of the grooves, because the grain goes in and it's slightly more dished at the centre, because although this is a good flat table area and every bit at the outside is the same height, the nearer you get to the centre, the wider the gap becomes between the two sets of stones. And so the grain, as it comes in, rolls inside, gets turned and is ground at the same time as it's being scissored. And how you cut those is you use these bills, they're pieces of metal shaped in this way, in a wooden holder, and you just sit there and you tap away for hours. But the trick when you're dressing the stones, which is what this is called and what the miller was doing quite obviously when he stopped work, was not just to cut deep grooves, but also to cut much smaller ones on top. And by looking at this, we can tell actually what was being ground here last. Because if you're using it to grind wheat, then the miller has a lot of work to do, because he has to cut 7 narrow bars per inch. But if, as with these stones, he was only using it for barley, then he just has to have 4. So by looking, we can tell what he was doing. But when you put them together, this is what you get. One sitting on top of the other on those gimbals, and despite the fact this is about half a ton I'm turning here, it's quite easy. Yet it wouldn't be so easy when you try to pull them apart. And what the millwrights used to use was this. It's a Lewis. It's basically just a shackle which you can attach ropes to, and you then have an arrangement whereby you make a wide triangle by pushing one bit down inside the other, and it forces that as a sort of tight fit in there, and you can pull up. But I must admit, I would be very cautious, because although you're using enormous blocks and tackle to get the ropes round and pull it up to bits in the ceiling, you are only working against that being held firmly in there. And at half a ton just above my feet, I think I'd be a bit more cautious. But this is the complete kit. And what you have is a ton. Pubs are very often called the 3 tons because a large barrel size like this is a ton. And it's a half barrel, in effect, that just sits over the stones to trap in all the loose dust, but also, of course, most importantly, the flour, which can fall down to the floor below. And all of the old wooden machinery here has rather romantic, old-fashioned, as you'd expect, names. Like this, it's got 4 legs, so of course it has to be a horse. You've got something here which looks as if you could fit your foot into it, so of course naturally it's called a shoe. And what the shoe does is, as the grain comes down by gravity through these sacks from the floor above, it goes into the hopper and it just works its way down to the shoe. Now, depending on the angle of the shoe, the grain will either roll faster or not as fast down there, so you control the flow rate. And similarly, the shoe is also kicked, because in the centre you've got this very important piece called the damsel. In these sort of non-sexist days, we'd be very cautious about calling something a damsel. But I think damsel is quite a flattering name, because the point of this was that, sure, it was a chattering damsel, as millers very often called it, but the whole point of hearing the chatter was something the miller wanted to hear. And he heard it because it was bouncing back and forth against the action of a willow spring here, and it spread the grain evenly between the two stones. And that was very important, because what he also needed to know was that one stone didn't sit directly on the other, because otherwise it would generate a lot of heat. And one of the ways to avoid that was, as the grain came down, it didn't just go into a hopper, it acted against the leather belt, which again gave you a ring just like that on the bell, and you knew that therefore things were working away quite happily. Because if they stopped for any time and there was that heat, there was always a real risk, with all the dust around, of an explosion.
To reach the stones, the grain would pass through the grills of the store bins, down wooden chutes, to be part milled en route.
On this floor, above the stones, there's a marvellous arrangement of chutes that come down out of the ceiling, and they're all bringing down the possibility of taking corn from this one or that one or that one, and at the top of each of these chutes you've got a different bin. And what they're coming down to are choices of different machines, and this was the secret weapon of the millers in the back end of the last century in this mill. But it was disaster for many mills, because this is a roller mill. Now, what had happened, suddenly corn began to be brought into this country in large amounts from the new prairies in the United States and Canada, and you'd think that would be wonderful news for millers. It was nothing of the sort. It was absolutely disastrous, because huge amounts were brought in. They brought into places like Liverpool docks. There were brand new mills put up. So all country mills like this one, suddenly their throats were being cut. Now, fortunately, the miller here was determined to keep going and was able to start rationalising and looking around. And one of the ways they were able to do that was to take advantage of one of the very things that were killing them. Because at these brand new mills that were intercepting the stuff coming in from America were ranks and ranks of these things. No longer the stones on the floor below, but roller mills. And they work in a different way, in the sense that instead of the stones just sitting one above another and being fairly large and rough, you have in here either metal rollers or porcelain rollers, which, because it is a machine with set distances, can be put so precisely that you can whip off the husk of the ear of wheat. And the minute you could do that, you could produce white flour. Up until that time, it had been very hard to do, and most of the country mills produced the sort of thing that now we all love, stone ground flour. But if you were a Victorian cook, stone ground stodgy flour yet again, so rough, when if only you could have white flour, the wonderful things that you could do with it, the light pastries you could make, you could rub in your fat into your brand new flour, and you could make the lightest of recipes. And of course everybody fell in love with it. So once again, the country mills were seriously under attack. But in this mill, by inserting just a small little roller mill themselves and having this above the stones below, they could make their own white flour.
These are the animal feed doors that signify a major change of use of the mill. They were put in halfway up around the time of the First World War, when it could no longer compete producing flour, and turned to animal feed. It was no longer necessary to take everything to the top of the mill. In this 19th century picture, the doors have yet to be put in. I showed this and other early pictures to Nancy Bly, who was born and brought up in the mill house beside the mill. Her family were the last owners when it was still a commercial working mill, and their name could be seen on its side.
Our family were millers, and our main mill was elsewhere, so flour was all made there, and this then changed over to being a provender mill.
Right, so animal feeds.
Animal feed, and also, you see, farmers would come with their horses and carts and bring their own oat to be crushed and the grist to be ground and the beans to be cracked, which would be done here. And that sort of thing is now done, obviously, electrically on farms. Dick Weller, who was the miller, because there was only one, he was the only person really in the mill in our days. But he was certainly here all my, when I was born, and when we took over, I think he was here.
So Mr. Weller used to do his own dressing?
He did his own dressing, yes. I can hear it, standing out here, I can almost hear now the chip, 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 where one would hear in the summer's day when he was dressing his own, the stones.
This is the mill office where so much took place that was really vital to the functioning of the mill. The miller would sit here at this wonderful Dickensian desk, and he would note down every sack of flour as it left and to be taken away by the carts and distributed round the area. And that really was just about the most important thing, because if you couldn't keep a control of the amount of flour that went out of the building, then you were not keeping a control of the cash, and therefore the economics of the mill would flounder. So this was really, in that sense, one of the most important rooms in the place. It's a lovely small room and relatively snug. But in here, the last of the millers was Mr. Weller. And he was able to not just keep control in terms of the economics of the mill in that way, but in another way as well. Because from the window behind, he was able to look out and look for the 3 R's, well, at least 2 of the 3 R's. He would look for the rooks. How the rooks were flying gave him an idea of how the wind direction was going, and so he was able to judge something about the weather. Sadly, since Dutch elm disease, we've lost the elms that were there that the rooks used to sit on, so it's a bit quieter from that point of view. But at least we can look out for one of the other of the 3 R's that Mr. Weller used to check for, and that was rabbits. Whether they were just sitting out on the hill or they were coming down for a drink, what the rabbit activity was, again, gave him an idea of how the weather was changing one way or another. Because if the water suddenly rose because there was a lot of rain coming, he needed to control the sluice, he needed to control the equipment inside. And with his 3 R's, he never got it wrong. He was always on top of the situation. The last of the 3 R's he didn't have to look for, because sitting in this office without extra heating, he could feel his rheumatiz. And the rheumatiz really told him again how much dampness there was in the air. And for him, strange enough, the rheumatiz was one of those 3 very important R's. Because in here, he couldn't have heating. Inside this floor where there was all the mill dust around, a slightest bit of a flame could ignite everything. So he had to sort of suffer his rheumatiz, but what he could do was try and keep the cold out, try and keep this room as snug as possible. And one of the ways that millers across the years have done that in this office, anywhere there was a tiny little crack, they've plastered it over. So today we can still find odd newspapers down with their dates from the last century, the miller's way of keeping out the cold.
Outside of the mill are teasels, loved by hoverflies, relics of part of the mill's story. It wasn't just a corn mill, it was also a fulling mill, involved in the cloth industry. The spikes teased up the nap of the cloth after it had been flattened by fulling. Historically, the mill was in the heart of what used to be England's main cloth area, on which the wealth of both the mill and the country was built. Wool was spun and woven in local cottages. The mill gave employment to up to 1,000 outworkers to produce cloth by the end of the 18th century, when the mill was owned by a Thomas Nottage. Yet this was the period when the spinning jenny and mechanised weaving were invented. This new cloth technology needed more water power than the mill's small river in the flat east of England could provide. John Saville, who took over in 1804, tried to put in some mechanical advances. Saville put in improved fulling stocks. The mill had long fulled cloth to felt it, to make the warp and weft less obvious by beating urine-soaked cloth in troughs with water-powered wooden hammers. But despite the changes, the industry moved away north, and in 1813 the mill became just for flour.
This water is remarkably clear, given where I'm standing, because I'm in the Milltail Tunnel, and that's the tunnel that goes right through the mill. You see, in very expensive large mills, where you were spending a lot of money on the whole of the structure, you were not going to put your wheel, which was after all the most important part, at risk of frost. And if you had a mill with a water wheel on the outside, there was always that risk, particularly if it was one with buckets, as this one was, of it freezing and damaging the wheel. So what they did here, as in many large mills, was to have it enclosed in the building, in the tunnel. But there's no documentary evidence of the size that the wheel was, because there is no longer any wheel here. It was taken out in the last century, but we can work it out. Up here is the stone where one on this side and one on that side, where the axles were positioned. So we know the width of the wheel was from right over there to over here, and very solidly in the centerpiece. But as to the diameter, well, it's quite easy to work out. Although there is no written evidence, the writing is, as they say, on the wall. There's a deep groove which runs all the way along the edge, where quite clearly, as the wheel turned and turned over the centuries, it caught the edge of the bricks and a groove was cut. And so for here, I can easily say it was a 19-foot diameter wheel. That's colossal.
Despite its size, the water wheel could only provide so much energy from the small river. To compete against the big roller mills, the miller needed more energy. So in the last century, this steam engine shed was erected. The steam engine provided power for another 3 sets of stones. So when Mr. Weller began work here in 1882, there were 6 pairs of stones, 3 steam, 3 water. And by 1892, the roller mill was added. Yet survival would not have been possible for the mill without the coming of the railway. This station was built just for the mill in 1848. Steam trains brought grain and took flour from the mill, not only to local towns, but direct to London. The mill was just 4 minutes by wagon from its own siding at the station. With the train, the mill could compete directly with the new larger millers. But ultimately, what kept the mill on the right tracks was to exploit the water even more efficiently by putting in a turbine pit inside the mill.
It's all right, I've got it.
Recent restoration work on the pit revealed a welcome surprise.
Now that is quite a find coming up out of the mud. This is the damsel, which is the bit that's at the heart of the stones as they turn round. But what happened some years ago was that when the mill was derelict and nobody was here, kids broke in, did various amounts of damage, but through this right down into the mud where it's lain ever since. But now at last we're beginning to sort things out and it's come back.
Country millers, by the end of the 19th century, were no longer fat cats. And to survive, many embraced turbines.
I'm standing at the top of the turbine shaft, and up here where the beveled gears link up with another beveled gear there, they take the power that comes up this way off into a shaft, and that links up with a whole series of wheels, which takes belt drives off to a whole series of machines around here. So this is where the power comes up through the building. And this turbine shaft goes all the way down through the building to the turbine pit a number of floors below. And it brings the power right up to here. And what it did was replace the water wheel, the turbine, many years ago. In 1893, it was a critical time. There was all this competition of foreign wheat coming in from abroad. How on earth could this mill compete? And this was their final solution, because by putting in a turbine, what they were able to do was produce from a small river 50% more energy than their enormous water wheel. They had a large water wheel, but despite its huge size, there was a limit to the amount of energy they could get out of it. It, after all, was only carrying around buckets of water each quarter turn, and they would empty. The great secret of a turbine was it was enclosed in a housing under a head of water, and therefore water was pressured into it, and it was able to drive veins all the way around the whole circumference. So the bottom of this shaft, its whole turning power is able to be brought right up here with 50% more energy. And with all that power, what do you do if something goes wrong? If one of these machines jams, because this shaft will be turning all of the time, and if this was metal, as it looks, onto metal, there will be a disaster. It would just hold and everything would break. So instead of that, what the miller did, these are actually apple wood teeth, although they look like metal because of the amount of oil that's on there, and they're intercepting with ones over there. So if something goes wrong, these would just strip out, and it was a simple process for him to just repair them by putting new ones in. But that wasn't their only trick, because with this permanent running power as it was coming in, they needed to be able to switch machines off after all. But with power coming in, and turning these wheels, turning, with this shaft up here, putting the power all the way across, they needed to be able to switch off. And what was the simplest way of doing that? Well, you have two wheels side by side, one of which is permanently in with the power, and the other one is just a slack wheel. And all you do is, by a linkage over there, you slide your belt from one onto the other, and suddenly it can just idle, and there's no problem at all.
By the miller taking on board the new technologies, our country mill survived into this century for further generations. In the next programme, I look at the making of the mill,